It's the week of Thanksgiving, and there's going to be a ton of football that's played before we even get to the weekend. Plus, we got a lot of food to eat, family to visit, things to buy online. That's why in today's show, I'm covering quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end rankings. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Happy Thanksgiving to you and your families. Now, this week is always super stressful for us because we've got a lot of football that's going to be played before we even hit the weekend. But we also know that you guys, it's a busy week for you too. A lot of things are going on this week. So to try and save some time, we've condensed our ranking show into one video here for this week. I'm going to cover the quarterbacks, running backs, wide receiver, and tight end positions all in this video. There's timestamps down below. But let's not waste any more time. Let's start off at the quarterback position. Now, before we bring up the rankings for this week, let me talk about a few of my bigger hits and misses from just last weekend. And if we look at the hits first, we got the likes of Anthony Richardson, Baker Mayfield, and Tua Tagovailoa. Now for Anthony Richardson, I ranked him as the quarterback 17. He finished as the quarterback 19. How about Baker Mayfield? I expected him to stay hot, but couldn't quite force him up inside tier 1. I ranked him as the quarterback 8 overall. He finished as the quarterback 8 overall. How about Tua Tagovailoa? He'd been such a disappointment, but I felt like he could take advantage of the matchup last week. I ranked him up inside the top 12. He ended up finishing as the overall quarterback 3, but I had some huge misses as well, like Caleb Williams, Will Levis, and Bryce Young. Now for Caleb Williams, he had a great matchup, but dude hadn't thrown a touchdown in like a month, so I couldn't rank him very high. He then went out and finished as the overall quarterback 4. What about Will Levis? I don't think anyone out there wants to trust Will Levis enough to rank him highly, but he did have himself a great week 12. Bryce Young, maybe one of the best games I've ever seen from Bryce Young. I really didn't trust him going up against that Spags defense, and he ended up finishing as the quarterback 12. But now we're moving past week 12. Let's dive into week 13 and bring up the tier 1 quarterbacks. And when we look at tier 1, we got the likes of Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, and Jaden Daniels. Now for Jalen Hurts, he's got a matchup going up against Baltimore. He's the current quarterback 2 overall, averaging over 22 fantasy points per game. This is actually going to be the first time he started a game against the Ravens. Now we know the Ravens are harder to run on than throw on, so we do expect a little bit more passing in this ball game. Now Devontae Smith, still questionable at the time of this recording, but Baltimore allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so for week 13, Jalen Hurts is at number 1. Right after him is Josh Allen going up against San Francisco. He's coming off the bye week and really hoping to have some pass-catching weapons back. Guys like Dalton Kincaid, maybe even Keon Coleman, both who are still questionable at this time. If he's going to be without them, though, we need to expect him to use his legs a little bit more in this game. Now, San Francisco does allow the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but right now, they're pretty banged up on defense. Then we got Lamar Jackson going up against Philadelphia, continuing his MVP run. He's the current quarterback 1 overall in fantasy football, has multiple touchdown passes in 7 of his last 9, but Philadelphia does allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so this one isn't an easy one by any means. Then we got Justin Herbert going up against Atlanta, and imagine the points he would be scoring if his receivers didn't drop so many footballs. Luckily, over the last 3 weeks, he's had at least 6 points per game of rushing production, and that is definitely helping his floor. Now, a matchup going up against Atlanta, they allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, so Justin Herbert up inside tier 1. Then we got Jaden Daniels going up against Tennessee. And what a difference a week makes. 2 weeks ago, he looked absolutely lost. Last week, he was the overall fantasy quarterback 1 on the week. He had a great day on the ground, but it was his first game with over 50 yards rushing in a month. Now a matchup going up against Tennessee, they allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, so Jaden Daniels back up inside tier 1 as well. All right, down to tier 2. And that's where we're going to find the likes of Baker Mayfield, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, and Bo Nix. Now for Baker Mayfield, he's going up against Carolina. He suffered a stinger last week, but all signs are showing that he should be okay this week. Now over the span of his career, he hasn't found much success in Carolina, whether he's an opponent or on the actual team. But now we know that Mike Evans is closer to 100% of his snaps, and Carolina does allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, so Baker Mayfield at the top of tier 2. Then we got Patrick Mahomes going up against the Raiders. It's nice to have fantasy-relevant Mahomes back. He now has 3 passing touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games played. Plenty of weapons to throw to, and it's always fun to watch him go up against Max Crosby. In this game, the Raiders are allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, so Patrick Mahomes stays inside tier 2 as well. How about Joe Burrow? going up against Pittsburgh, coming off the bye and right into a tough matchup against the Steelers. As of right now, the Steelers allow the fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, but Joe Burrow has been so hot as of late. Even though the ceiling may be a little bit lower, he's really playing too well to drop him any further in the rankings. Then we got Kyler Murray going up against Minnesota, and we're really going to need the rushing upside to return, or we're really going to start getting more boom or bust type performances from Kyler Murray here on out. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think it'd be a good idea to throw the ball to Marvin Harrison a little bit more. But now in a matchup going up against Minnesota, who's way easier to throw on than run on, Kyler Murray's right here towards the bottom of tier 2, along with Bo Nix going up against Cleveland. And he is just racking up games with at least 17 fantasy points. He's now done that in 6 of his last 8 games played. Now, Cleveland is much easier to throw on than run on. They allow right around the league average to opposing quarterbacks, so Bo Nix, with the way he's been playing, staying up inside the top 10 at number 10. Which then takes us down to tier 3, where we have a handful of quarterbacks that are all interchangeable. With no bye weeks, there's just a ton of great options. Now in this tier, we got the likes of CJ Stroud, Russell Wilson, Jared Goff, Jordan Love, Tua Tagovailoa, Matthew Stafford, Sam Darnold, Anthony Richardson, Geno Smith, and Brock Purdy. Now for CJ Stroud, he's going up against Jacksonville, and no, he has not been playing great football here as of late. But we have a chance at some fantasy points, and that's all we care about right here, because he's going up against Jacksonville. And there is no team in the NFL that allows more fantasy points per game to the quarterback position than the Jacksonville Jaguars, so I had to put CJ Stroud right here at the top of tier 3. Then we got Russell Wilson going up against Cincinnati. Back-to-back bad fantasy games for Russ is not ideal, but this matchup is so much better going up against Cincinnati. The Bengals allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so Russ is right here at number 12. Then we got Jared Goff going up against Chicago, and you just never know what Jared Goff is going to show up. Nothing consistent from him weekly. Now we know that Monty is banged up. Amon-Ra St. Brown is banged up, and now they have a matchup going up against Chicago, who allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. However, Sam Darnold did torch them last week, and that's why Jared Goff is still this high. Then we got Jordan Love going up against Miami. And he would have had a great fantasy day last week if it wasn't for Christian Watson out there playing football with oven mitts for hands. Now a matchup going up against Miami is not going to be easy though. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and Romeo Doubs is in the concussion protocol. We may see a ton of Josh Jacobs in this matchup. Then we got his opponent in that game, Tua Tagovailoa, going up against the Packers. He now has 7 touchdowns over his last 2 games, and most of it is not due to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. No, most of it is due to Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane. Last week, Jalen Waddle chipped in, but Miami has to keep winning ball games. They can't afford to lose anymore this entire season. In a matchup going up against Green Bay, they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, so I've dropped Tua down a couple spots. Then we got Matthew Stafford going up against New Orleans, and he had that hiccup back in week 10. But from week 8 on this season, he is the quarterback 7 overall in fantasy football. Now, Demarcus Robinson did get arrested on suspicion of DUI and for driving over 100 miles per hour. But that's okay, he still has Kupp, he still has Puka, and that's enough in this matchup going up against the New Orleans Saints. How about Sam Darnold going up against Arizona? He had another solid fantasy day in week 12. He now has 10 touchdowns over his last 5 games. If only some of those touchdowns could go the way of Justin Jefferson. Now, Arizona allows the 10th fewest fantasy points per game, and their defense is playing really well here as of late, so I've dropped Sam Darnold down a few spots. Then we got Anthony Richardson going up against New England. Does he run one in this week or not? We know he's going to be without Josh Downs, and that hurts the passing game. So it's really going to come down to whether or not he has any rushing upside in week 13. But with so much riding on just the rushing production, I got Anthony Richardson down here at 18. Then we got Geno Smith going up against the Jets, and the Jets are easier to throw on than run on. They've been pretty average against quarterbacks here in fantasy football in 2024. But Geno has only had double-digit touchdowns 3 times this year. It's really hard to rely on bigger games when they just don't happen very frequent. And then lastly, Brock Purdy going up against Buffalo. And this one is obviously dependent on whether or not he's even going to play this week, but I did want to include him. He had a throwing session here earlier in the week. He felt okay, so we're going to have to see how things progress throughout the rest of the week. This is not an easy matchup for him, though. Buffalo does allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but if he is 100% healthy, Brock Purdy's probably going to be closer to the top of tier 3 than the bottom of tier 3. Which will get us through the quarterback position for week 13. Now it's time to transition into the running back position. But before we dive into my quick and dirty top 36 running backs for this week. Let's take a look at some of my bigger hits and misses from last week. And let's talk about some running back hits first, like Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, and Kyren Williams. For Saquon Barkley, I had him slotted coming into the week as the overall RB1. He did not disappoint. He finished as the overall RB1. Josh Jacobs, no one really seems to love Josh Jacobs besides me. I had him ranked inside the top 10 last week. He finished inside the top 3. And then Kyren Williams. He had a tough matchup, and I just could not rank him highly. He hadn't been producing here as of late. I put him at the RB13, and he finished as the RB14. But there were some big-time misses for me in Week 12, like Bucky Irving, James Conner, and Tyrone Tracy. Now, Bucky Irving, with the split in this backfield, it's impossible to figure out whose week is it going to be. Bucky absolutely killed it in Week 12. I had him ranked way too low. James Conner, how about Arizona couldn't get anything going against Seattle in their game coming off the bye week? I had James Conner ranked way too high. And then Tyrone Tracy. I expected more volume with a new quarterback. He didn't get it, and Devin Singletary vultured the touchdown, absolutely killing where I had him ranked for Week 12. But let's go ahead and move forward to Week 13 and look at the Tier 1 running backs first. And when we look at Tier 1, we got the likes of Saquon Barkley, Joe Mixon, Devon Achane, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, Derrick Henry, and Alvin Kamara. Now for Saquon Barkley, he's going up against Baltimore, and he's the new #1 overall running back in fantasy football. He's had at least 198 total yards in 3 of his last 4 games played and has 6 touchdowns over those 4 games. Yes, this matchup absolutely sucks, but how do we question him at this point of the fantasy football season? Then Joe Mixon going up against Jacksonville. He's a top 5 running back on the season despite missing 3 games this year, and that's even after having a bad game just last week as well. This one, though, is a great matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we got Devon Achane going up against Green Bay, and he's finally made it back up inside the top 10 running backs on the season. His yardage, it's been kind of hit or miss, but with Raheem Mostert being a non-factor, Devon Achane is just racking up the touchdowns right now. In a matchup going up against Green Bay, they allow just under the league average to opposing running backs, so it's not the easiest of matchups. Then we got Jahmyr Gibbs going up against Chicago. And with David Montgomery banged up, we could be in line for a little bit more Jahmyr Gibbs this week. He's already the running back 3 overall on the season, and Chicago is easier to run on than throw on. They allow just over the league average when it comes to fantasy points per game for the running back position. Then we got Bijan Robinson going up against the Chargers. He's coming off the bye and hoping to start another string of 100-yard games. He's had over 100 total yards in 7 of the 11 games this year. Now, the Chargers do allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, but we just saw Derrick Henry run for a $140 on them. Right after Bijan is Derrick Henry going up against Philadelphia. Easy matchups, tough matchups, it doesn't matter for Derrick Henry. He hasn't had under 10 fantasy points in a game this year, and he just ran for 140 yards against a tough Chargers defense. Now, Philadelphia, it's not going to be any easier. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but the King deserves to stay in Tier 1. Now, to round out Tier 1, we got Alvin Kamara going up against the Rams. He's coming off the bye, and he gets a good matchup. The Rams allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to running backs, and they were just torched by Saquon Barkley in Philadelphia last week. All right, now we move down to Tier 2, where we have Josh Jacobs, Kyren Williams, Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, James Cook, Chase Brown, Jonathan Taylor, David Montgomery, and Kenneth Walker. Now, Josh Jacobs has been absolutely scorching hot as of late. 4 straight games over 100 total yards and 6 touchdowns over his last 4 games. He's all the way up to the running back 7 overall on the year, and he's been doing it with some tough matchups. Detroit, Chicago, and San Francisco. Now a matchup going up against Miami, they're easier to run on than throw on, so Josh Jacobs the top of Tier 2. Then Kyren Williams going up against New Orleans, and he's really been disappointing for the most part here as of late. 5 of his last 6 games, he's had less than 100 total yards and only has 1 touchdown over the last month of the season. But this one is a good matchup going up against New Orleans. They allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we got Christian McCaffrey going up against Buffalo. And I would really love to have Brock Purdy back so that could boost the touchdown upside in this overall offense. Last week was the first time this year that Christian McCaffrey had failed to go over 100 total yards. But if he can get Brock Purdy back, he's going to have a great chance to do it this week against Buffalo because they allow the third most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then Breece Hall going up against Seattle. And what Jets team decides to show up this week is the biggest question. Now, Breece Hall, he's had at least 80 total yards in 6 straight games. But Seattle's been pretty solid on defense here as of late, especially against the run. They've allowed less than 70 yards rushing in 2 of their last 3 games played. So Breece Hall right here towards the bottom of the top 12 at number 11. Then we got James Cook going up against San Francisco, another running back coming off the bye week, and he hasn't been killing it when it comes to yardage over the last couple months of the season. Touchdowns are really keeping him afloat. In fact, he's got touchdowns in all but 3 games this year. Now, San Francisco is easier to run on than throw on, and we just saw Josh Jacobs torch them last week, so James Cook is at number 12. Then we got Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against Pittsburgh. Another guy coming off the bye week and right back into our fantasy lineups. He's had at least 10 fantasy points in 7 of the last 8 games he's played. He's also had at least 90 total yards or a touchdown in 4 straight ball games. Now, obviously, the Pittsburgh defense is pretty solid against the run, but with the volume that Chase Brown is getting and his explosiveness, he's still sitting right here mid-tier 2. Then we got Jonathan Taylor going up against New England. And we can blame Anthony Richardson somewhat for the struggles of Jonathan Taylor, but the volume is just hit and miss. Now we know Josh Downs is hurt, Michael Pittman isn't 100% healthy, but New England does allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so we're going to need a touchdown here this week from JT. Then we move down to David Montgomery going up against Chicago, and it sounds like we dodged a bullet with a Monty injury. Sounds like he's going to play, and he still wants to take it to his old team, the Chicago Bears, who are easier to run on than throw on. And then we round out tier 2 with Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Jets. Not a great matchup, but Kenneth Walker's been a solid running back to most of the season. He's had 90 plus yards or a touchdown in 3 straight games. This should be a close game, which will help keep the running game relevant. Which brings us down to tier 3, where we have Bucky Irving, Aaron Jones, Chuba Hubbard, James Conner, Tony Pollard, and Tyrone Tracy. Now for Bucky Irving, he's going up against Carolina, and fantasy rule number 306 is always start your running backs against the Carolina Panthers. On top of that, Bucky's been fairly consistent as well. He's had at least 10 fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games played, but no team allows more fantasy points per game to opposing running backs than the Carolina Panthers, so Bucky Irving up inside the top 20. Then we got Aaron Jones going up against Arizona. 25 touches last week makes the eggplant twitch a little bit. Cam Akers sucks. Just feed Aaron Jones. He's now had 100 plus total yards in 2 of his last 3 games played. Arizona has been easier to run on than throw on here as of late, even though their overall defense is playing pretty well. How about Chuba Hubbard going up against Tampa Bay? And can Carolina play as well this week as they did last week? Because Chuba's yardage has been down for the last few weeks, but the touchdowns are definitely propping him up. He's had a touchdown in 7 of his last 9 games played. Now, Tampa Bay, they allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so Chuba stays up inside the top 20 because Jonathan Brooks really isn't a factor yet. Then we got James Conner going up against Minnesota, coming off a horrible game, but let's give a little bit of credit to the Seattle defense in that game. They played really well. Arizona couldn't really do much of anything in that ball game. This week, though, isn't going to be much easier. Minnesota allows the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to running backs, so that's why James Conner's down at number 20. Then we got Tony Pollard going up against Washington, and he really benefits from Tajay Spears being hurt. As of right now, Spears is still questionable to play, and we really need to keep Tony Pollard around 20 touches, otherwise he's probably going to disappoint you and your fantasy team. He's just not as efficient as in years past, and he needs that overall volume. Now, Washington is pretty average against the run, so there's a chance for a good game here for Tony Pollard, just inside the top 24 at 21. Then we round out tier 3 with Tyrone Tracy going up against Dallas. And what do we get out of the Giants offense this week? We know Daniel Jones is gone. Tommy DeVito is hurt. Drew Lock feels like he's been lied to and he's pissed off. Not an overall great situation for the Giants. This game just needs to stay close because Dallas allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, and we could be in line for some heavy volume going the way of Tyrone Tracy. Which takes us now down to tier 4 of Najee Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Rashad White, Kareem Hunt, Nick Chubb, and Jeremy McNichols. Now for Najee Harris, he's going up against Cincinnati, and we saw the streak of 5 straight games of at least 10 fantasy points come to an end in week 12. It was a tough game against Cleveland though. The weather absolutely sucked. This one is a much better matchup going up against Cincinnati though, and with Najee getting right around 18 touches a game, he's still up inside the top 24. Then we got Ramondre Stevenson going up against Indianapolis, and he's really been hard to trust here as of late. 6 games this year in double digits, so really, you got a 50-50 chance of him being fantasy viable. A great matchup though going up against Indianapolis. They allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so that definitely helps the chances of Ramondre Stevenson this week. How about DeAndre Swift going up against Detroit? And Chicago had one of its best offensive performances last week in quite some time, yet it was one of DeAndre Swift's worst games of the year. But now he's going up against Detroit. Do we have some Detroit revenge game vibes kind of going on here, or has it just been too long? Now, Detroit does allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. That's really because opponents fall behind early and can't run the football. Can Chicago keep pace and continue to use DeAndre Swift? There's a lot of risk there. That's why he's just outside the top 24. Then we got Rachaad White going up against Carolina. And just like with Bucky, you start your running backs against the Carolina Panthers. Rachaad White has 5 straight games with a touchdown, and the passing work will continue to be there as long as this is a close game or Tampa is losing. Remember, no team allows more fantasy points per game to the running back position than the Carolina Panthers. Then we got Kareem Hunt going up against Las Vegas. And Isaiah Pacheco is coming back, but I still expect this to be at worst a 50-50 split backfield. Pacheco is going to be worked back in a little bit slowly. This backfield is going to be tough to figure out though for the rest of the season. As of right now, at least for this week, I slightly still lean Kareem Hunt. Going up against Las Vegas, they allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we got Nick Chubb going up against Denver. And thank the fantasy gods for a couple of Chubb touchdowns just last week, because he was only averaging 2.9 yards per touch. However, did go over 20 touches for the first time since returning to games this season. Now, Denver is much easier to run on than throw on, so Nick Chubb is a flex-worthy option just due to his inefficiencies as of right now. Then we round out tier 4 with Jerry McNichols going up against Tennessee. And with the injuries to Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler in the concussion protocol, we could see Jerry McNichols get the start this week in Tennessee. A revenge game against his former team as well. That's why he's right here at the bottom of tier 4. Which means all we have left is tier 5. It's Travis Etienne, Rico Dowdle, Jalen Warren, Isaiah Pacheco, Amir Abdullah, Javonte Williams, and J.K. Dobbins. For Travis Etienne, he's going up against Houston, and he may be going back to the lead back role in Jacksonville, but that's not as lucrative as it used to be. Plus, we do not know at the time of this recording whether or not we're going to have Tank Bigsby or not. Tough matchup as well going against Houston. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we got Rico Dowdle going up against the Giants. And it's great that he's getting weekly volume, but weekly volume on a bad running team isn't exactly great. However, one of the few games this year that Rico Dowdle had where he was actually fantasy viable was against these New York Giants earlier in the season, where he was able to find the end zone. The Giants allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Rico Dowdle right here in tier 5. Then Jalen Warren going up against Cincinnati, and he was saved by a touchdown last week. I really prefer him in better matchups, and Cincinnati is actually a little bit easier to throw on than run on. Then we come to Isaiah Pacheco going up against Las Vegas, and like I mentioned earlier, I expect him to be worked back in a little bit slowly, but he's always a threat for the big run or a goal line touchdown in this offense, especially since the matchup is so good, so I had to include him in the top 36. Then we have Amir Abdullah going up against Kansas City, and this is an absolute horrible matchup for him, but if Alexander Mattison and Zamir White sit, we could see Amir Abdullah get some passing work, and that's why he's inside the top 36. How about Javonte Williams going up against Cleveland? Who knows who to trust in the Denver backfield each and every week? It's like playing weekly whack-a-mole, especially in a tough matchup like this. Cleveland is a lot easier to throw on than run on. We're just hoping for a short Javonte Williams touchdown this week. And then lastly, J.K. Dobbins going up against Atlanta. He's currently questionable to play at the time of this recording, and Atlanta is pretty solid against the run. If J.K. Dobbins is ruled out, we're just going to slot in Gus Edwards in his spot in the rankings. Now, if J.K. Dobbins does play, he's probably not going to move up much in the rankings just due to the risk of him getting re-injured during that game and being pulled out, which will get us through our top 36 running backs here for Week 13 fantasy football, which means it's now time to talk about some ball catchers for Week 13. Now, before we dive into this week's top 36, let's see how I did last week in Week 12. And let's look at our hits first for the wide receiver position. We had Courtland Sutton, Nico Collins, and DeAndre Hopkins. Now for Courtland Sutton, I had him all the way up as a Verge top 12 wide receiver last week, up inside tier 2. Then he finished as a top 3 wide receiver, had himself a great week 12. Nico Collins, and people were getting frustrated with the Houston passing game overall, but I held my ground. I kept Nico as the wide receiver 7, he finished as the wide receiver 8. And then DeAndre Hopkins. I felt like a lot of people just forgot about him last week. I ranked him up inside the top 20, he finished as the wide receiver 16. But I had some big time misses, of course. How about Jordan Addison, Jalen Waddle, and DJ Moore? For Jordan Addison, dude had like 3 fantasy viable games all year long, and people want to act like he should be some smash start each and every week. He had a great game. It happens. I had him ranked too low. Jalen Waddle, it's a weird time for him to have his best game of the season. But I'm one of those guys that wants to keep him up inside the top 36, just like I do every week. But then he went out and had himself a top 5 week in week 12, had him ranked way too low. And then lastly, DJ Moore. So hard to trust any Bears offensive pieces. Caleb Williams hadn't thrown a touchdown in a month, and all the weapons were healthy and on the field. DJ Moore just ended up having the highest output of them all, and he was a miss. But now we roll into week 13. Let's bring up tier 1 for the wide receiver position. And when we pull up tier 1, we see the likes of AJ Brown, Nico Collins, Jamar Chase, Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now for AJ Brown, he's going up against Baltimore. No team allows more fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers than the Baltimore Ravens. Plus, we also know that Devontae Smith, he's still questionable to play at the time of this recording, and this game could easily turn into a shootout, so AJ Brown sitting at number 1. Number 2 is Nico Collins going up against Jacksonville, and this one is all about the matchup. Nico is close to being back to 100% of his snap count, and Jacksonville allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Now after Nico, we got Jamar Chase going up against Pittsburgh. He's coming off the bye. He's the current wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy football, averaging just under 20 fantasy points per game. He's had 10 plus targets now in 4 straight games and has 7 touchdowns over his last 5. Difficult matchup this week, though, going up against Pittsburgh. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then we got Puka Nacua going up against New Orleans. More of the big play guy in this offense, has had 9 plus targets in 3 straight games, and he gets a good matchup this week going up against the Saints, who allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then we move down to Justin Jefferson going up against Arizona. And could we please get some Justin Jefferson TDs? Because he's now been under 100 yards in 3 straight games and no touchdowns over his last 5. Now, Arizona's been playing pretty good defense here as of late, but does allow right around the league average when it comes to fantasy points scored by opposing wide receivers. And then we round out tier 1 with Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against Chicago. Not the greatest matchup going up against the Bears, but Amon-Ra has been one of the most consistent fantasy wide receivers this season. Chicago allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, though, to opposing wide receivers, so Amon-Ra St. Brown at the bottom of tier 1. Now after tier 1, we move down to tier 2, where we have Mike Evans, Cooper Kupp, CeeDee Lamb, Courtland Sutton, George Pickens, Terry McLaurin, Drake London, and Tyreek Hill. Now for Mike Evans, he's going up against Carolina. So we got death, taxes, and Mike Evans absolutely teabagging the Panthers every single year. It happens almost every single game. And I'm glad that we already know that Baker Mayfield is good to go for this week as well. Now Carolina is a lot better against the pass than the run, but Mike Evans, like I said, yearly takes advantage of Carolina. How about Cooper Kupp going up against the Saints? And even with Puka eating in this offense, Kupp is still able to produce just fine in this offense as well, especially in a good matchup like this one, where I said the Saints allow the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. How about CeeDee Lamb going up against the Giants? And no doubt the volume is going to continue. It's just going to be for lower yardage, and the TDs aren't going to be as consistent. Now, the Giants allow just under the league average when it comes to fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, so CeeDee Lamb at number 9. Number 10 is Courtland Sutton going up against Cleveland. He's all the way up to the wide receiver 8 overall on the season. He's getting great volume. He's getting frequent touchdown chances, and the Cleveland Browns allow the 5th most fantasy points per game. How about George Pickens going up against the Bengals? I'm not concerned about the bad production in the snowstorm last week. I mean, he's still fighting people on the sidelines, so he should be good to go. This is a much better matchup for him this week, though, going up against Cincinnati, who does allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then we got Terry McLaurin going up against Tennessee, and he was totally saved by a last-second 86-yard touchdown just last week. He's been pretty boom or bust here as of late, at least over the last month or so of the season. And I mean that literally. He's either over 100 yards or under 20 in each of his last 4 games played. Now a matchup going up against Tennessee, they allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so he's going to need another one of those big plays. How How about Drake London going up against the Chargers? He's coming off the bye, and he had a tough matchup against Denver prior to the bye. This matchup going to be a little bit easier, but really needs a touchdown. He only has one 100-yard game all year long, and right now the Chargers are allowing right around the league average in fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. How about Tyreek Hill going up against Green Bay? We just saw Jalen Waddle pop off, so anything is possible. It's just not consistent like it used to be. We know Tyreek Hill isn't 100% healthy, but Miami has to keep winning ball games. Going up against Green Bay, they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, so Tyreek Hill right here at the bottom of Tier 2. Now after Tier 2, we get down to Tier 3, where we have Ladd McConkey, Garrett Wilson, Calvin Ridley, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Malik Neighbors, T. Higgins, Brian Thomas Jr., and DK Metcalf. For Ladd McConkey, he's going up against Atlanta, and at this point, he's turning into a mid to low end wide receiver 2 weekly. He's hovering right around 10 to 12 fantasy points per game, and we know that Quentin Johnston can't catch much of anything out there. Plus, this is a great matchup going up against Atlanta, who allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. How about Garrett Wilson going up against Seattle? And hey, guess what? Another boom or bust wide receiver to worry about. Now, he's had back-to-back bad games, but out of the options in New York, he is still the safest option. In a matchup going up against Seattle, they allow right around the league average to wide receivers as well. How about Calvin Ridley going up against Washington? And we can't really count on TDs every single week, so we're going to need some big-time chunk plays. In a game in which Washington should have the lead, Tennessee's going to have to throw the ball for all 4 quarters, so I got Calvin Ridley right here at 17. Then we got JSN, Jackson Smith and Jigba going up against the Jets, and it's great to see him string together 3 really good games. He's really benefiting from slot snaps, and with the volume he's seen, he's basically a locked-in wide receiver 2 as of right now. This is going to be a tough matchup for him. The Jets do allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so hopefully they can get creative and move him around the field and try to get him the ball in space. Then we got Malik Neighbors going up against Dallas. A great matchup, but dang, the quarterback play is just absolutely killing Malik Neighbors' production. Best case scenario, honestly, is Drew Lock at quarterback, but that's really unknown right now. But we do know that Dallas allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we got T. Higgins going up against Pittsburgh. It's pretty simple. If T's on the field, he produces, with or without Chase. Really, the only reason he's this low is it's a pretty tough matchup going up against Pittsburgh, who does allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then we got Brian Thomas going up against Houston. He's coming off the bye week, and it's either Trevor Lawrence or nothing for Brian Thomas. If T-Law plays, Brian Thomas is a top 24 wide receiver easy. If Trevor Lawrence sits, he may not even be up inside the top 36. Now, as of right now, Lawrence is scheduled to practice this week, so keep an eye on it because this is a great matchup. The Houston Texans do allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and then we round out Tier 3 with DK Metcalf going up against the Jets, and I would really like to say this is a better matchup for him this week. But between the matchup and JSN really emerging as of right now, DK has turned a little bit more boom or bust, especially in a week like this going up against the Jets, who allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game. All right, now down to Tier 4. And in Tier 4, that's where we got Zay Flowers, Jacoby Myers, Khalil Shakir, Jamison Williams, DeAndre Hopkins, Marvin Harrison Jr., Jaden Reed, Devontae Adams, and Darnell Mooney. Now for Zay Flowers, he's going up against Philadelphia, and the yardage has really been down here as of late, and that's really because they're not having to throw the ball as much. Derrick Henry is running all over everyone. This game, though, if they want to win it, they're going to have to throw the ball. Now, Philadelphia does allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game, so it's not going to be an easy one for Zay Flowers. Then we got Jacoby Myers going up against Kansas City. The biggest question here is the quarterback play. It sounds like Aiden O'Connell is in line to start this week, so Jacoby Myers should continue to see enough targets to make him a Verge wide receiver 2 each week. Kansas City, one of those teams that allows right around league average fantasy points to wide receivers. Then we got Khalil Shakir going up against San Francisco, the safest weekly wide receiver in Buffalo. At this time, Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid are still questionable to play. Now, the San Francisco defense isn't fully healthy right now, so Khalil Shakir could have a safe floor. Then we got Jamison Williams going up against Chicago. And it is so hard to know what Detroit offense is going to show up weekly. A run-heavy one? A pass-heavy one? I mean, going against Chicago, they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But Detroit could just run the ball all 4 quarters and still put 40 points on the board. Now, because of that, Jamison Williams is just going to be a little bit more big play dependent once again this week. Then we got DeAndre Hopkins going up against Las Vegas. Now, Noah Gray is out there just killing all the Kansas City studs as of right now, but DeAndre Hopkins still is the top wide receiver option weekly. It's just tough since Patrick Mahomes spreads the ball around so much in this offense. In a matchup going up against Las Vegas, though, it's not the easiest one. They allow less than the league average. Then we got Marvin Harrison Jr. going up against Minnesota, and this should be an absolute smash start. This should be a week where he's ranked up inside the top 10, but for whatever reason, Arizona refuses to throw him the ball consistently. He's only gone over 6 targets one time in the last 6 games. Minnesota allows the second most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, but just due to the lack of consistent volume, it's hard to rank him any higher. Then we got Jaden Reed going up against Miami, and man, I miss the days of consistent Jaden Reed. But it is worth noting that Romeo Doubs is currently in the concussion protocol, so there is a chance that Jaden Reed has a bounce back week this week going up against Miami. It's a tough one though. They allow the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we have Devontae Adams going up against Seattle, and he's a little bit more touchdown dependent than Garrett Wilson, and the Seattle defense is playing really good football right now. Even though they allow right around the league average to opposing wide receivers, it's really going to take a touchdown for Devontae Adams to really outproduce this ranking. Then we got Darnell Mooney going up against the Chargers. He's coming off the bye, but he did suffer a hamstring injury pre-bye, so it's definitely something to pay attention to. We need to see what his availability is heading in to this week's game. It's not the greatest of matchups. The Chargers are a solid defense against the pass, but I put him right here at the bottom of tier 4, and really just wanted to tell people not to forget about him, pay attention to his availability throughout the week. All right, down to tier 5, where we got Deebo Samuel, DJ Moore, Jalen Waddle, Jordan Addison, and Jerry Jeudy. Now for Deebo Samuel, he's going up against Buffalo, and he's really tied to the availability of Brock Purdy. That, and he really hasn't done anything for the last 6 weeks. He hasn't really given us a reason to rank him higher each week. Now matchup going up against Buffalo, they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and as of right now, we don't even know who the starting quarterback is in San Francisco. Then we go down to DJ Moore going up against Detroit, and now he's got back-to-back games with at least 10 fantasy points. This Chicago offense has actually looked a lot better here the last couple of weeks. Does that make DJ Moore safe in fantasy football? Absolutely no way. But he does remain the high ceiling guy in Chicago. In a matchup going up against Detroit, they allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so DJ Moore up inside the top 36 still. Then we got Jalen Waddle going up against Green Bay, and he finally had a great fantasy day just last week. Was that a fluke, or is that the new norm? Because in this matchup going up against Green Bay, they allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, and with Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane out there soaking up the bulk of the production in this offense, Jalen Waddle is going to remain pretty boom or bust. How about Jordan Addison going up against Arizona? And he's got touchdowns in 3 of his last 4, and for some reason, he continues to outproduce Justin Jefferson. Now, that's not something I'm banking on long term, but he does deserve to be up inside the top 36 in a matchup going up against Arizona. They're playing pretty good defense right now, so it's probably going to take another one of those big plays to make Jordan Addison viable, and then we round out the top 36 with Jerry Jeudy going up against Denver. Is this the Jerry Jeudy revenge game against the Broncos? Now, Denver, one of the toughest matchups in the league. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But if they can move Jerry Jeudy around maybe in the slot a little bit more, he has a chance to rack up receptions with the amount of volume he sees in this Cleveland offense. So there you have the top 36 wide receivers here for Week 13 fantasy football, which means the only position that we got left is the tight end position. Before we dive into those rankings, let's take a look at some of my bigger hits and misses from just last week. And let's talk about our hits here at the tight end position first. Guys like Jonnu Smith, Trey McBride, and Zach Ertz. Now for Jonnu Smith, I'm really hoping a lot of people listened this offseason when we talked a ton about Jonnu Smith, because he's even exceeding my expectations, and I loved him coming into the season. I had him inside the top 8, he finished inside the top 5. Trey McBride, he continues to be the number 1 receiving option in Arizona. He's going to be a top 3 guy weekly. And then Zach Ertz, he continues to be ranked as a low-end top 10 option, continues to finish as a low-end top 10 option. Some of the bigger misses, guys like Noah Gray, Brock Bowers, and David Njoku. Now Noah Gray, I guess I just picked the wrong Kansas City tight end, right? Because I wanted Travis Kelce to score some touchdowns. Didn't happen. They went the way of Noah Gray. Brock Bowers, I expected a lot more. He got decent volume, had 10 targets, but could not turn it into anything. And then David Njoku. Between the tough matchup and the snowstorm, he wasn't able to do a whole lot of anything. I had him ranked way too high. But that's over and done with. Let's hip thrust into Week 13 and talk about some Tier 1 tight ends. And we look at tier 1, we got tight ends like Trey McBride, George Kittle, Brock Bowers, Travis Kelce, and Cade Otton. Now for Trey McBride, he's going up against Minnesota. He's coming off a game where he had 15 flipping targets. It's clear at this point that Marv isn't going to be taking any volume away from Trey McBride. The volume plus the decent matchup puts Trey McBride at number 1 this week. Then we got George Kittle going up against Buffalo. No Purdy, no problem for George Kittle. He is the safest weekly start in San Francisco as of right now, and they're going to need him in this matchup going up against Buffalo. Now, Buffalo does allow just under 9 fantasy points per game, so let's hope that George Kittle can find the end zone once again. How about Brock Bowers going up against Kansas City? The volume remains, but the quarterback play is just holding back his consistency. Now a matchup going up against Kansas City. They allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to the tight end position. In their last meeting just a couple weeks ago, Bowers had 5 catches for 58 yards. How about Travis Kelce next? His opponent in that game going up against Las Vegas. And imagine if Noah Gray wasn't stealing all these touchdowns over the last couple of weeks. Las Vegas allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the tight end position, and let's hope that it's Kelce's turn, because in their last game against Las Vegas, he had 10 catches for 90 yards and a tutty. Then we move on to Cade Otton going up against Carolina. Sure, having Mike Evans back is going to limit the volume going the way of Cade Otton, but I'm not panicking here just yet. They had a huge lead last week and did not need to involve Otton any more than they did. But really the main reason why I'm not too concerned, their matchup this week going up against Carolina is a great one. There is no team that allows more fantasy points per game to the tight end position than the Carolina Panthers, so Cade Otton up inside tier 1. For tier 2, this is where we got Taysom Hill, Jonnu Smith, David Njoku, and TJ Hawkinson. Now Taysom Hill, he's going up against the Rams and he's coming off the bye, and he's about to either win you your matchup or score you like 3 fantasy points. You can't pass up the fact, though, that he gets you rushing attempts and targets every single game. The ceiling is too high, and the Rams allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. How about Jonnu Smith going up against Green Bay? He's the current tight end 4 overall on the year, and he's been the best pass-catching part of the Miami offense for weeks. Now a matchup going up against Green Bay, who allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, on top of the fact that his touchdown opportunity seems to be there weekly. I got Jonnu Smith at number 7. David Njoku right here at number 8 going up against Denver. And let's just blame the snow for the Week 12 performance, but we know that David Njoku needs the big play. He's not going to be that guy that goes out each and every week and gets you more than 5 receptions. He needs a touchdown. He needs a big play. And now he's got a matchup going up against Denver, who allows just over 8 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. The biggest issue here for David Njoku, Jerry Jeudy's been taking away his ceiling here as of late. And then we round out tier 2 with TJ Hawkinson. Now he's going up against Arizona this week, and he's coming off his best game of the year, his first 100-yard game of the season. He now has at least 70 yards in 2 of his last 3 games, but Arizona allows the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to the tight end position. But at this point of the fantasy season, there is no way that you can put a tight end who goes out there and gets you 7+ catches a week any lower than he currently is right here at tight end 9. Which means all we have left now is tier 3, where we got Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram, Dallas Goedert, Tucker Kraft, and Hunter Henry. For Mark Andrews, he is 100% reliant on touchdowns. He has one in 5 of his last 7 games, though, so people have been pretty content with starting him. But if he doesn't score, he disappoints you, and this is a tough matchup going up against Philadelphia, who allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. How about Kyle Pitts going up against the Chargers? He's coming off the bye, but he's only had 1 catch in 2 of his last 3 games. He only has 10 total targets over his last 3 games combined. Plus, he's not some big touchdown guy. In a matchup this week going up against the Chargers, they allow right around 8.5 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and I think we'd be happy to get that from Kyle Pitts this week. Then we got Evan Ingram going up against Houston. He's coming off the bye as well, and he's really tied to the availability of Trevor Lawrence, who may be back this week. But Evan Ingram hasn't gone over 50 yards receiving in a game since week 2. Now a matchup going up against Houston, who already allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to the tight end position. It's really hard to throw Evan Ingram any higher than he currently is. Then we got Dallas Goedert going up against Baltimore. And he's really only got 3 fantasy viable weeks all year long. Now, Devontae Smith is still questionable to play, and Baltimore allows the 11th most fantasy points per game to the tight end position. We know Philadelphia is going to have to throw the ball, but Dallas Goedert hasn't proven to be very consistent. Then we got Tucker Kraft going up against Miami. And for whatever reason, the Packers have decided it's better to not use Tucker Kraft, and they'd rather throw the ball to Christian Valdez-Scantling on the outside. Now, Kraft only has 3 total targets over his last 2 games combined, but Miami does allow 10 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And then we round out the top 15 with Hunter Henry going up against Indianapolis. He's a safe tight end too. Not enough touchdowns to go around in this offense to really put him any higher than that, but the matchup isn't horrible. The Colts allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and really that's the only reason that Hunter Henry made it up inside the top 15. All right, so there you have all the rankings you need for Week 13 fantasy football. Now, maybe you also need some flex rankings, kicker rankings, or defense rankings. We have those as well, but you'll need to become a member of the channel in order to access those. You'll also get access to Discord, a members-only live stream, additional bonus content, and so much more. So consider becoming a channel member right now. It's super simple. All you got to do, hit the little join button right below the video. But I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day, have a great Thanksgiving weekend, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics, off the chain, other channels, not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headline Nation, we running the game.